Music theory with OneNote. Modes formula adding color. Get ready and some coffee because although we're just playing with OneNote, it's a beautiful note. You're not required to, but if you have access to it, would like to follow along, we're currently in the OneNote file of Modal Node System, MNS Presentation 2134, OneNote Modes Formula Adding Color, list of presentations, which we plan on adding plenty more to shortly. Also noting in this OneNote presentation, we're going to spend all of our time on the music theory side of things, but we have another similarly numbered and named presentation where we build these tables in Excel, practicing Excel, music, and just table visualization all at the same time. Our overall objective, to maximize the use of color to better understand music theory in general, better navigate the fretboard more specifically, not by just randomly picking color and just dropping it on the fretboard like some bum spilling soda on the carpet or something like that. No! We want to have an absolute color system so that we can actually name all 12 notes, not by the note letter, not just by the note number, but by the note color. The note color alone could tell us what notes that we are playing. Wouldn't that be great? And we can also have a color system for each of the modal points within the system. So for example, our fretboard with the low or heavy E string, the one closest to the ceiling on top, we currently have colored the 7 note collections around the C major. Remembering in practice, we could tone down the color by, instead of coloring all 7 notes within the collection, only coloring those notes that we're focused on. But when we color those notes, we use the absolute color system. So the C is always going to be this type of green. The A is always going to be this type of red. That gives us a great type of association to be able to name each of the 12 points. However, similar to learning the note letters, that doesn't really map on all the time to what we want to memorize in terms of the 7 note collection that we're focused in on. So instead of using a color system that is going to be tied to the notes, we might tie them to what we call like the continents in the analogy that we've looked at in prior course or sections. So the Ionian node, the Phrygian node, the Dorian node. Why would that be? Because that's going to be more maneuverable upwards. So in other words, if we go from the collection of notes around the C major to the collection of notes around the D major, and I use an absolute system, each of the notes having a different color, you can see the A here has the same red, even though up here it's the Aeolian node, and here it's the Mixolydian node. So maybe I want an absolute color system that's going to keep those things the same. So for example, we're back to where we started, but this time, even though we have the same 7-note color system, it's not tied to the C, it's tied to the Ionian. We're going to use this color system as our default to basically move up, so the Ionian is always going to be this green, the Aeolian's always going to be this red. So now this system will show this shape as we move up. So if I move up here, now we're in the 7-note collection around the D major, and you can see the red has now changed because it's tied to the Aeolian node. And in that system, you can see how the shape is going to basically move up. So those are the 2 primary ways that we're using color right now. We're saying I have a color system that I can tie to an absolute 12-note system, and I can use basically the key of C color system to name the nodes, so I can map that through as I count through the different modes that I'm working in. Now, if we wanted to add another dimension of octaves as we go up an octave, now this color's a little bit off because it should be green here, but you get the idea that we have the lightness. We added the lightness factor, so it's going to go up in lightness. So that gives us that dimension as well. So also just note, now we're going to look at modes. People often have problems with modes in general, what modes mean. When you look at chord books, they often make modes way more confusing than they need to be, as though you have to completely memorize from scratch a complete set of 12 times 7 different collections of notes. That's not exactly the way you want to visualize it, of course. That would be crazy. How we want to visualize it instead is that we have 12 notes in the musical alphabet, and each of those have 7-note collections. So we have 12 7-note collections that we're going to be typically working within. Within each of those 7-note collections, we can make any of the 7 notes the focal point. So that's what we call the mode, in essence. From a practical standpoint, that's what we call the mode, meaning we're making the tonic one of the 7 notes within the collection. So that's what we want to tie out to our color system up top. So let's take a look at this now. We're going to say we started by saying we have the letters, which is going to be an A sharp, or B flat. I'm going to represent with a lowercase a, B, and then C, which is a 4, and then we have C sharp or D flat, and then we have the 6, which is a D, 7 is going to be a D sharp or E flat, 8 is going to be an E, 9 is an F, 10 is an F sharp or a G flat, 11 is a G, 12 is a G sharp or A flat, and then it repeats back to the A, an octave up, but we're going to visualize it in essence as a circle. So we're not really counting octaves right now. I'm not getting into going an octave up. I'm visualizing it as a circle, remembering the 2 ways that we can visualize sound is from a linear standpoint and also from a circular standpoint. The true 3D shape is a spiral, but it's hard for us to visualize a spiral, so we have to kind of pick one. Are you thinking of it as a note number line or as a circle? So it's kind of going around the circle, we can imagine repeating here. I've also added these dots and squares because this is another way to visualize the shape, which I think is useful to see. Meaning, if I give a note number, you can kind of visualize the shape by breaking the numbers into even and odd numbers. So when we start to use the formula whole, whole, half, whole, half, you'll start to see that, oh, we have an odd, 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 even, even. Sometimes people don't like to look at numbers as much though. So you can, if we assign a dot and a square or a filled in thing and a non-filled in thing, then we can say this is going to result in the formula whole, half, whole, half will result in dot, square, square. Or if I start on a square, it'll be square, dot. So I think that's just another interesting way to kind of look at it. But we're focused in on the color. So what I really want to do is start to memorize the colors. Now, I've mainly been using colors in the past, as most people do, as kind of a reference tool to draw my eye to it. But the more I look at the color, the better it would be for me to associate the color with the note. We've got an independent color for each of the notes. We mapped the color wheel onto the pitch wheel. So what I'd like to be able to do is say red is note number 1 or an A. So I can actually say when I'm talking about an A, I could say the red note. I want to be able to see that color so sharp in my mind that the A is the red note, right? It's the start of the spectrum for the color spectrum. And if you know the color spectrum, you can see how the notes map onto it, because the notes align up to the color spectrum, right? So the next one up is going to be orange red. We might just call it orange because I don't think we have any other orange here. So basically orange is going to be the note number 2, A sharp or B flat. Yellow is going to be note number 3, which is a B. Yellow green, so we get a little bit muddy on this, is going to be a note number 4 or a C. And then just solid green is going to be a C sharp or note number 5. The spring green, move it into blue, is going to be note number D or note number 6 or a D. And then cayenne is note number 7 or a D sharp or an E flat. And then sky blue is going to be note number 8 or an E. And then just blue, or maybe dark blue, navy blue, is going to be note number 9 or an F. We're going to have violet, which is an F sharp or note number 10. F sharp or G flat. We have magenta, which is going to be note number 11 or a G. And then rose, which is going to be note number 12 or a G sharp. So if we can remember actually these color names, and if we can actually visualize the color spectrum, remembering the color spectrum goes up to like around here, and then they fudge it to go into a circle. These last 2 notes are bending it back to a red, right? So that's not exactly the color spectrum. We talked about that before, but it works perfectly as an analogy for our system. So we're visualizing the color wheel, which is the color spectrum, and then they plugged in the wraparound to get it back to the A. And then those repeat over here. So if we look at the modes, then if I pick, we're going to first typically work in the key of C and use our formula, which is going to be whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half, which of course results in the key of C of not having any sharps and flats. So if I start on the C, whole, go to the D, whole to the E, and then half to the F, and then whole to the G, whole to the A. Notice I'm in the second set of notes, but that's okay because it goes around in a circle, and then whole to the B, and then it goes back to the C. Notice what that does with the squares, right? We're going to say, what does that do with the squares? It's a square, 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 and then circle. And now I had to switch because we had a half step circle. So we have circle, 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 and then back to a square, right? Or if you have even and odds, it was, if we started on an even, 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 right? And then odd. So then it goes to the odds, odd, 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 right? And then back to even. Okay. So anyways, that's going to be the Ionian. So a lot of people have trouble with the modes because they're Greek names, and people, I think it's because of the chord books and whatnot, have really kind of made modes complicated in people's minds, but they shouldn't be. They're actually the easier way to see it. What we'd like to be able to do is have that absolute modal system. So I'm going to number the modes 1 through 7. These are Roman numerals. Why use Roman numerals? Because they have the ability to have capital and lowercase, giving us an added dimension, which people often use to indicate whether it's going to be a major chord construction or minor chord construction. This is just a convention. It's not really the best way to see that because it doesn't tell you all the chords, like if I go to the 7 or the 9 or whatever. But that's a convention people usually often pick up, and it's great for just starting to memorize songs and stuff. The problem is when we move to the Dorian, they change the number system for the relative scale positions. That is something that has worked historically, and possibly because of the way sheet music has worked, it's not the optimal way to do it, and it causes us all kind of problems. What we'd like to do is go with the Nashville number system, which doesn't change the number. And you're going to say, well, that's the cheating way. That's a hack or something. It's like, no, that's actually the better way to do it, right? So, I mean, seriously, it's like it makes way more sense to map out, particularly on a guitar, but even on the piano, by not changing the system here. So we've talked about that in a prior course or section, but that's going to be the idea. So we've got the Ionian, the Dorian, the Phrygian, the Lydian, the Mixolydian, the Aeolian, the Locrian. These are our 7 notes that are named by modes. Now remember, when we look at these 7 modes, you can think of them as scales. That's what people often kind of think of them as. There's 7 different scale collections. But they're all, if you start from any of these nodes, they're all the same 7 notes. And you can also think of them as nodal points. So the Ionian in the key of C is going to be the 7 note collections around the C major is note number 4. The Dorian is note number 6. The Phrygian is note number 8. The Lydian, right? And these Roman numerals represent that note, not just a chord or not just a scale, right? They can represent both, but we can see them as a point. So we have the modal abbreviation. The letters I'm going to give them is an I for Ionian, D for Dorian, P for Phrygian, and then we go a little off to a Y because Lydian looks kind of like a 1. So Mixolydian, we don't want to mix it up with major or minor, so we use an X for Mixolydian, and Aeolian A, and then Locrian, I don't want an L again, so we're going to use an N because Locrian's the weird one, the crazy one. It's backwards. That's why the N kind of makes sense, at least in my mind. And so then we've got the formula. Whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half. This is how most people typically see it. We'd like to see it with a number because that's going to tell us how many spaces we actually move. So whole, whole is 2, 2, 1, 2, 2, 2, 1. So in other words, if I start on C, we go up 2 to D, we go up 2 to E, we go up 1 to F, 2 to G, 2 to A, 2 to B, and then 1 takes us back to C again. Remember that these steps represent the in-between points to get from one node to another node. Okay, now if I wanted to look at the formula for the Dorian, then it's not, again, the books, like textbooks, make it look complicated sometimes because they say, well, the formula is now something totally different, but it's not totally different. It's the same series that repeats kind of like a circle. We're just going to wrap it into a circle, but we start at the second one. So you can repeat the same thing in your mind. The Dorian is the 2. So I could say whole is the one I'm not starting on, and then I'm going to go from the Dorian whole step from there. I mean, whole step to half, whole, half, whole, getting me back to the Dorian. If I start on the Phrygian, that's the third one down. So to get there from the Ionian, I must have done a whole to get to the Phrygian. So from the Phrygian, it's going to be half, whole, half, whole, half to get back to the Phrygian. From the Lydian, that's going to be the fourth mode down. So if I think about the formula in my mind from the Ionian, it went from 1 to 2 was a whole, and then half. So now on the Lydian, to go up from the Lydian to Mixolydian, it's this 2, whole, half, whole, half. So you can kind of, again, you don't really want to memorize them as though they're not connected and they're completely different formulas. You want to see them as one linear formula that you're taking a piece of, right? You're looking at a particular part of the formula. All right, so now we want to add our color into this. So if we have the scale positions 1 through 7, we're looking at all the 7-note collections. How many 7-note collections do we have? Well, there's 12 notes in the musical alphabet, and we're picking 7-note collections. So we have 12 7-note collections. The collection of notes is a term that a lot of people don't use, right? They just say we have scales, and they kind of skip the idea of the collection of notes. But it's useful to say, look, I have 12 different collections of notes. That's like having the crayon boxes with 7 crayons in it. I'm not telling you which crayon I'm going to make the primary color that I paint my picture in. So I can use any of those crayons in the crayon box then to make my central color to paint the picture in. So that means that each of those 12 7-note collections have 7 different modes. So you can think of it as we have 12 times 7 basically scales, but really we only have 12 sets of 7 notes, and then we're just rotating which is the center point or the focal point, the main thing within each of those kind of crayon boxes. All right, so how does that work? Well, if I look at my formula here and we have our Roman numerals, we're going to say, here's our colors for, why is it doing that? That's weird. Let's move this up a bit. It won't let me do that. Let me do it over here so it doesn't mess up the bottom part. Okay, so here's going to be our 7-note collection. So now we've given these, so this is in the key of C, which is kind of like our default that we often go to in Western music. So these are the colors that we're gonna most likely be most familiar with. That we want to start to memorize those colors. So we've got the green, which is going to be not the normal green. This is the yellow green, and then we've got the spring green, and then we've got the sky blue, and then we've got the normal blue, and then we've got the magenta, and then it goes to around the circle back to red, and then we go to yellow. So those are going to be I want to keep on practicing memorizing the actual names of those because I can name these 7 notes by just those color names. Those are absolute color names. They don't change. So that, and from a note standpoint, it's note number 4, which is a C, note number 6, which is a D, note number 8, which is an E, note number 9, which is an F, 11 is a G, 1 is an A, and 3 is a B. Okay, so what if we want to play in the related Dorian? there are two ways that we can move if you're playing musically and you're in the collection of notes of the key of C, then you could switch to any of the other related modes because you have the same 7-note collection. How do you do that? You just change the focal point. You start painting the picture not in this green, but this blue becomes the dominant color that you're going to be using. That means that now you're playing the same collection of notes, but the feel has changed because you changed the dominant color from green to blue. That's basically changing the relative modes. Or you could say, I'm gonna keep in the key of C and use that as my pivot point. So I'm gonna stay in the key of C and I'm gonna slightly change the crayon box. I'm actually gonna switch to a different crayon box, but the root is gonna stay the same. So you're not gonna notice it as much. It's gonna be a subtle change because this green is the same, but now I'm gonna have a crayon box that has at least one crayon that's different that I'll kind of sneak in there, and then we'll have a different crayon box that we're using. All right. So let's go down here and say, okay, if I do the related modes, it would look like this, right? I'd say, okay, so now we're in the Dorian. So I was in the key of C. This was the main color I'm using. Now I'm going to say that this green is the main color. So instead of having the green yellow, we're going to say we're in spring green. Spring green is now the main color that we're looking in, which is tied to the D. Now, note that later we might have a color system. We might want to use a color system that's tied to the modes, which is going to be based on this color system. So that would mean, that's going to mean that I'm going to have the same color system that's not always tied to the notes. It's tied to the absolute modal positions, which would still be the same this green as we go up to here, but that's not going to be the same when we go into the other collections of notes. We'll talk about that later. But so now we have the same 7-note collection. It's just that we're starting on this one. So we've got the spring green. I think that's the sky blue, the blue. This is going to be then the, what did we call that? Magenta, and then the red, and then the yellow, and then that's the spring. That's the yellow green. That's the green yellow for the C. Okay, so then we can go down to the next one. So if I was on this 4, what if I make this crayon the major point? Same crayons, that would be the Phrygian. So we're going to say, okay, let's put this one up so it doesn't get messed up. We're on the Phrygian now. So notice the problem most people have is that when I go to the Phrygian, they change the scale positions to make this the 1. That's a problem because that means I have to rememorize all of the relative positions. I don't normally want to do that. I'd rather keep it as the 3. That's in essence what the Nashville number system does, which people usually talk as like a hack, meaning they say, well, look, I'm just going to pretend that we're playing in C major, but this is going to be the root. So which makes it sound kind of like a hack, but it's not really. It's actually a more sophisticated way to say it. Yes, you're going to be playing the collection of notes named from the C major, but the focal point is going to be the 3, right? So that means I don't need to rename my Roman numerals. Notice that my Roman numerals then will still give me the indication of whether I play a major or minor chord, meaning this blue here is going to be this is sky blue, is always going to be a minor chord because it's the 3. It's the 3 chord. I'm just starting on the 3 chord. If you call it the 1, then you have to change your Roman numeral system. Now sometimes they do that. That's what they normally do. Your textbooks will change this to the 1, and then they'll have a Roman numeral lowercase 1. Which means now you have the 1 sometimes is uppercase and sometimes is lowercase, depending on if you're in the Ionian mode or the Phrygian mode or something like that. There's no practical purpose functionally to do that. That's madness to do from a normal playing standpoint. It makes you memorize 7 different scales that you don't need to do. So that's why the Nashville number system came about. But the reason it's called a hack is because the textbooks don't like it. It's not because it's not because it's not actually the better system. It is the better system. Okay, I'm sorry, it just is. So then what about the Lydian? Okay, so what if we go to the Lydian? Then we have the collection of notes starting with the 4. So now we start on the dark blue. I'm trying to memorize these colors myself here. To the magenta, obviously, magenta, red, yellow, and then the green, yellow, and then spring green, I believe, and then the Lydian. So obviously for the Lydian, we're starting on the dark blue, magenta, red, yellow, green, yellow, spring green, and sky blue. And then on the Mixolydian, we're just going to start on the 5. Same kind of concept, of course, starting on now the 5. So here's the formula, but all the formula is doing is starting on this next, on the 5 and counting down from there. It's the same formula. So we start on the magenta, the G, to the red, to the yellow green, to the spring green, to the sky blue, to the normal blue, and then in the Aeolian, which is the minor scale, we're just going to now start on the 6. So this is the other main scale that we work in. Now the red is up top, which is an A, to the yellow, to the green blue, to the spring green, to the sky blue, to the dark blue, and then to the magenta, and then the Locrian lastly, which lost its thing up here. My thing got messed up. So there it is on the Locrian. Okay. So then the other way we can look at this is say what if I want to look at the modes where we're not going to use the same collection of notes, but we're going to pivot around the focal point. So now we've got the 12 notes collection. So I'm just going to list them all out. 12 note collections starting in the key of C, 1 through 12. Now this is normally the way we talk about a collection of notes, meaning most people think about the collection of notes or they know the formula as whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half. If you tell people what is the formula for Phrygian or something like that, it's going to be hard to pull that up in your mind. Most people can't do that, right? Because the first thing they learn is the major scale. So when you talk to someone, it's polite, it's nice to say, even if you're playing in Mixolydian or in the minor scale even, you might say, hey, look, I'm looking at the collection of notes around the related major, whatever the major or Ionian node is, but we're focused in on the 6th. If it's the minor, for the minor 6, that's going to be the root, or we're focusing in on the Dorian, right? That would be the nice way to do it, but most people don't do that, right? What they do is they say we're playing in A minor, which means you have to kind of know that the A minor is related to the C major because you're possibly more familiar with knowing the collection of notes tied to the Aeolian or major, right? Okay, so let's say we did the collection of notes around the A. So this A major or the A Ionian. So now we've got the A is red, we've got the B is yellow, but now we've got the normal green. This green is not the same as that green. This is just the standard green. We still got, what did we call that? The spring green, the sky blue. Now we've got this purple. I think they called it violet. And then we've got this one, which is also different. I think it's rose rather than magenta that we have now. So we have 2 different notes in here. Now, if I was to go down here, this thing got out of whack. We're going to say, now I'm going to keep, this time I'm going to keep the A the same. I'm pivoting around the A, but now I'm in the A Dorian instead of A Ionian. So we have a different set of notes. This was going to yellow, and then this normal green is now the C, which was the green, yellow. And then the D is the same, and then we got the sky blue, and then we've got the violet, and then we've got this one was, I believe, rose, but now we're in magenta over here. Okay, and so let's go to the next one down. Let's pull this up, and we're going to say the next one, I'm pivoting around the A, this time for Phrygian. So the A is always red. We're keeping the same focal point, But instead of going to the yellow, now we're going to the orange. And then we have the C that we had up here. We've got then the sky, the spring green, the sky blue. Then we have the dark blue instead of the violet. And then we've got this one is magenta, I believe. And then we go down to the next one. So now we're going to once again pivot around the A, but now we're in A Lydian. So we still are pivoting around the A. So we're just going around, and most of them are the same, but the second note is now different now. So we were an orange, now we have a yellow. And so we had a C here, which was green, yellow. Now we're on standard green, C sharp. And then we had a spring green, and now we're in cayenne, I believe was the name for that one. And then we have the same for the sky blue, and then we were in the dark blue, but now we have the violet, and then we had then the magenta, and I think this is rose. I think those are the differences there. And then if we go to the next one, now we're in Mixolydian. We're in A Mixolydian, still A. We have the same yellow, the same standard green, but we went from cayenne to green, blue. Sky blue is the same. Violet's the same, but we went from, I believe, rose to magenta. Okay, and then we're going to say we have then the A Aeolian. So same A here, but now we're in the A Aeolian. So we have the same yellow. Instead of the standard green, we've got the yellow, green, yellow. We've got still the mint, or the, I like to call that mint, but they call it spring green. And then the sky blue. And then we went from violet to dark blue. And then we have the violet, I believe that is. And then if we go to Locrian, we've got the A, we went from yellow to orange. We still have got the green, yellow, the spring green, the sky blue goes to cayenne, dark blue, and then the, am I getting the rose and magenta correct? I don't want to mess that up. Magenta is the pink one, and the rose is more reddish. Okay. All right. And so that's the general idea. So then we can follow that all the way through. So this is going to be then the A sharp or B flat. Let's go to the next one. It might be a little easier to look at the ones that aren't sharps and flats, and then we can go back to the sharps and flats, right? So if I go to a B, so now we're in B, this is B Ionian. So B Ionian, if I apply the formula to it, right, meaning if I go over here and do the whole, half, right, I'd be here, whole, half, whole, half, getting us back to the B. So if I pull those notes over here, then we get a B, which is a yellow. We get the normal green, which is a C sharp. We get the cayenne, which is a D sharp. We get the sky blue, which is an E. We get the violet, which is an F sharp. We get the rose, I believe, which is a G sharp. And we get the orange, which is an A sharp. Then if I compare that, if we pivot around the B, going from the B Ionian to the B Dorian, we've got the same B, of course, because we're pivoting around that. We get the same standard green. We go from cayenne to green yellow. We got the same sky blue. We've got the same violet. We've got the same rose, but we go from orange to red. And then if I go from B Dorian to the B Phrygian, then we got the same yellow, of course, because we're pivoting around the yellow. We go from green then to the green yellow. We've got then the same spring green. We've got the same sky blue. We've got then the violet. We go from, I think this is rose actually, to violet. And then that one always messes me up a little. And then we've got the red is the same. So then if I go to Phrygian, from B Phrygian to B Lydian, and by the way, you might also be comparing each of these to the root, meaning you're oftentimes probably going to be switching a lot from Ionian to Aeolian. And because that's the major and the minor. And then what we want to do is compare the related majors to the majors and the related minors to the minors because they will be most similar. So in other words, this one down here is Lydian, which is actually closer to the Ionian meaning major than the minor. So in other words, if I compare it to B major, I had a yellow and then a green, yellow and then a green, and then a cayenne, sky blue, and then this one is a dark blue. Violet is still violet. I think that's a rose to an orange, and this goes rose to an orange. That's because we only have a 1 interval difference from the major modes to the major modes, which we can define by color. What about the Mixolydian? It's a major mode as well. So if I go to the major mode for up here, wait a sec, Mixolydian, let's do it this way. So let's go up. We're going to say, okay, we have the yellow is the yellow. We've got then the normal solid green and then the cayenne. So that is the same here. We've got the yellow, green, cayenne, sky blue, and then violet. So then sky blue and violet. But then we have I think that's the rose to the red. And then here we've got the rose to the red. Where's the difference? Hold on now. I got messed up here. I started to panic, but I think it's right because the last one should be the one. I don't think I scrolled up enough. It should be orange turned red, right? And then here's the Aeolian, which is the minor scale. So on the minor scale, this one's going to be the one that's most different, you would think. It's actually the Phrygian that's most different from the major. But now we've got the yellow, green, cayenne goes to the yellow, green, but now the third has a different color, which is going to be the green, blue. And then we've got the sky blue and the violet versus sky blue and violet. And then we go from I think that's rose to orange versus then the magenta to red. All right. And then the Locrian is going to be more like the minor. So that's going to be the general idea. So let's just do well, I won't go through all of them, but you can compare basically all of these, right? For all of the different 12-note collections. So again, it looks overwhelming, but if you start to kind of break down how they fit together, it's not so bad, and then you can move it down this way. So here's all of our collections of notes and the color schemes for them. Now remember, these color schemes are great to memorize the notes, but if I move back on over here with the analogy we talked about before, is that these collection of notes on the fretboard works out great because I'm only looking at the notes on the fretboard that are in my collection. So even though the colors are all going to be changing, I'm always only looking at the notes that are in the collection of notes. But the colors are going to change based on the note, and maybe I want the colors to stay the same by what I call the continents. So remember, our analogy in a prior course or section is that this is analogous to the planet, and the fretboard, we can imagine, is spinning around in a circle, and we want to figure out which collection of notes where the continent is, and then basically see the shape in a particular position. So to do that, we might want to keep the same colors. In other words, if I'm watching the globe spin from space, then and I'm assigning a color scheme to all the continents on the globe, I'm going to want the color scheme to be the same, even though the world is spinning around. So if the world is spinning around and I choose that I want to be focusing in on this position for the C major, then this is the color scheme. Now we're going to use this color scheme is going to be for the Ionian now, not tied to the C. So now I'm going to use that same color scheme, and when I move the planet up, and we're going to say the world rotated, so now the Ionian is in the position of the D, instead of changing the color tied to the absolute note of a D, we can keep it tied to the continent of the Ionian. So that way, so to do that, it's not like we have then the color, it's not like we have the color wheel mapped onto the 12 note wheel that way. We are instead locking in place the colors that are related to the 7-note collection for the key of C, meaning all of the continents have the same colors, so that when the world rotates around, when the world spins, we have the same colors that are going to be rotating around. Therefore, the colors will change for all of the notes, because the notes are kind of analogous to a grid not tied to the planet, right? Up above the planet. So the grid is, so we're moving under the grid, right? But we want it to have the same color. So those are the two main ways that we can map things out. So when you're looking at the fretboard, you can start to memorize and associate each note with a particular color, but we can also associate each note with the continent, each color with the continent as the default continent notation, so that you can get used to seeing the same color scheme and really easily identify the pattern. Like, this pattern is going to become very specific, not just because of the pattern, not just because of the note names, in particular, not because of the note names, but because the color scheme would always be the same if you did it that way. Okay, we'll talk about that later.